Um, so hello, my name's Connor Cook, and I'm one of the researchers in residence at the Non-Extractive Architecture Research Residency in Venice. So today I have the pleasure to speak to Jose Sanchez, an architect, game designer, and theorist based in Detroit, Michigan. This interview is a part of a series of conversations that we're having for the Non-Extractive Architecture Project, where we're attempting to question and understand what a non-extractive architecture might be. So roughly, that is an architecture that's not dependent on the depletion of finite resources for its existence. But so far, the research has taken quite an expansive view of what extraction is in architecture, also questioning more immaterial forms of extraction, like extraction of knowledge, labor, creative labor, etc. And this is something that I found quite interesting in your recent book, The Architecture for the Commons. So one of the recurring themes in our research has been that a non-extractive architecture might require a redefinition of the role of the architect, or a shifting of agency, the agency of the architect into different forms. And so I think Jose's work is very inspiring in this regard for us, as it seems to question the idea of where architecture can be conceived, and if that architecture is always conceived by the architect themselves. So Jose is the director of the Plethora Project, a research studio that's behind architecture video games such as Blockhood and Commonhood. And I view these games as sort of ways of developing, on the one hand, new modes of authorship in architecture, but also kind of a different sensibility and approach to design, one that's taking into consideration questions of interdependence, ecological thinking, and systems thinking. So with that, I'd like to thank you again very much for joining us today and having a conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Connor. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So I mentioned in this intro that you had recently published a book, Architecture for the Commons, which has been quite interesting for us to read. I've shared it with some other residents as well. And my first question for you would be, why the commons, and why is the commons a relevant framework for architects and architecture today?
Right. So my interest in the commons is basically in the understanding of social systems and social systems that create and work towards to maintain their own production, right? So the notion of stewardship towards the resources and the production of resources that they are generating as a collective, as a coordinated collective, is very much what I think it's necessary in a framework to lead architecture away from, what is discussed as some of the problematic economic practices of neoliberal practices within the field. So when we talk about self-provisioning, I think that the framework of the commons, is certainly the framework to start thinking when we, let's say, the do-it-yourself initiative, what is the final result of that? And not just thought as a kind of individual, as a kind of individual that's completely dissociated or alone in regards to a social system, but rather kind of a social system that can actually collaborate, and it can collaborate not only purposely in a way, but also when we start thinking about digital platforms and kind of forms of different forms of technology in the mix, we can really start thinking of commons as a global enterprise as well, something that could be expanding the notion of commons as we do practice them today in communities, right? So the subtitle of the book, Participatory System in the Age of Platforms, really talks about how digital platforms in many ways are problematic, but also have the potential to create collaborative organizations and social organizations that ultimately contribute to the fortifying and the design of the commons as well, right? So that word really became central to really start piecing how technology and different the relationship of humans in a social system really take part.
Yeah, I really appreciated my kind of limited view of the commons when I first read the book was one that's concerned with material resources. And I think that's what initially pulled me to this book, was in a project about extraction. Here's a way of kind of a framework for thinking about a common set of material resources. But then almost instantly in the book, you defined extraction in actually a very different way than I had anticipated. Can you explain a bit further in the book how you viewed extraction in relation to kind of the extractive practices of platforms, platform capital, etc.
Sure. So in my research, if you study the commons, you instantly gravitate towards someone like Elinor Ostrom, right? And Elinor Ostrom definitely talks about common pool resources. And in that extent, you could really connect the practice of extraction in regards to the tragedy of the commons, of how certain practices do appropriate a larger portion of material resources. But I think that my research obviously took me to more of an economic foundation of some of these issues. And I think that someone like Mariana Mazzucato, who has been particularly important in some of the ideas in the book, certainly starts talking about all forms of rent-seeking practices, right? And I think that that's where architecture has a lot to say, especially when we see architecture struggling with an affordability crisis for the housing market, when the practice of architecture continuously, especially in the real estate sector, has become a very extractive practice, but an economic practice that seeks rent-seeking as a form of revenue, right? And that is considered an extractive practice. A second tier of this extractive practice is understood on how different large technology companies has, in the framework of someone like Mariana Mazzucato, Shoshana Zuboff, in the context of surveillance capitalism, how the extraction of data really becomes also a mechanism for behavioral manipulation, as she describes it, but obviously like a new form of currency, right? One in which there could be persuasion, there could be even kind of an erosion of democracy, right? So I think that the extraction is understood in different levels as a kind of a problematic condition that we should be aware of and we should be challenging in many different ways.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what I really appreciate about your work through projects like Blockhood and Commonhood is, on the one hand, you are very much kind of speculating, but also bringing these sort of new forms of authorship into the world, but then also at the same time kind of thinking ahead towards how platform design in the wrong hands could also become a quite extractive process in architecture. And I think this sort of mixture of kind of anticipatory, kind of anticipating these dynamics and actually bringing them into practice is quite exciting. Because on the one hand, I think you mentioned this in the book, but architecture maybe is actually in a lucky position in the sense that we're a bit behind on the on kind of the widespread platformization of the field. And maybe on that note, I mean, just from my own observations, it seems like I'm beginning to see, sort of outside of the context of your work, also definitely other cases where platforms are entering into the discipline and also increasingly affecting the way that cities are designed and conceived of. Something like ArcGIS City Engine or whatnot are kind of seem to hint at almost like the becoming game or the platformization of architectural production. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to this trend that you see of kind of existing market products that are beginning to pop up, and what you make of this shift.
Right. For me, it seems natural looking at other industries and obviously other kind of successful, from an economic standpoint, at least, an economic trend towards the use of platforms for collecting, labor and data and potentially all the analytics that could happen with that. And we're certainly starting to see companies that are adopting that model with software that it's not just kind of an open-ended software where you can do whatever you want with it, but in a way what a platform is doing is kind of in a very careful way, I would say, limiting the action of the user in a way, or mapping the action of the users and the interaction between users as well. There is potentially a collective intelligence emerging, but one that is in the hands of a specific platform, right? I cannot, give testament that this is actually occurring in some of the examples that you mentioned, but I do see, I do anticipate that we're going to be seeing more of this trend happening, and I find that problematic, right? I think that it's described in the book. Some of these examples are not part of my research, so I don't mention some of those, but it's definitely looking at how platforms like even Facebook or social media platforms really operate under a very kind of centralized notion of control, and one that doesn't really conceive of even notions of democracy. And what does it mean to really think of a kind of a democracy within a social platform? Right? Is there a kind of a feedback loop between the digital citizens that participate of that platform, or potentially the kind of any regulatory body that would suggest what are the behaviors that a platform might or might not have? I think that we've been seeing a little bit of this problem with notions of censorship, and if they operate purely as kind of enterprises or kind of private enterprises, I think that model, it's been a little bit it doesn't really convey how these players are operating at such a large scale, and it's expanding. It's certainly kind of growing. So we ought to be not only criticizing it or kind of finding its problems, but rather designing it, right? I think that's where, even if my projects, I would consider them small software projects in comparison, obviously, but I think that there is an attempt of really kind of tackling some of the technical issues with some of certain ideas and theory that obviously is framed in the book, and understanding what are the challenges, the technological challenges, some of the theories actually are kind of put in practice with something like a video game, and some of them work, some of them don't work, or there's kind of resistance or friction in certain moments. So that allows me to really kind of present my research in some of my publications, in the papers and so on, and then obviously continue the tinkering with softwares that could allow kind of horizontal peer-to-peer production where there could be exchange, and ultimately where the value produced by a community remains in the hands of the community, right? And I think that's kind of, for me, the critical question is, how do we allow platforms that operate as Trevor Schultz would call it, as cooperatives, right? Where there's kind of a platform cooperativism emerging, so that the platform is not demonized as a technology that we shouldn't use, but perhaps is designed to offer a synergistic where the contributions of users really kind of create a synergistic production, and one that it's serving the collective, right? As opposed to kind of siphoning the value produced to the top. So that's kind of where the research stands, is really trying to do that through the lens of video games in particular, which I argue that I think that they're very well equipped for architectural thinking. I think that's been cases for at an urban scale, at kind of a much more smaller like building scale. There's been softwares that engage non-expert users, and those have been mostly video games, I would say, in the production of architecture, even if that architecture has not been associated with what we would call the academia, right? Like, I think that but I think that there's kind of a great resource there where we could actually start talking about the production of architectural literacy and an architectural value from an online community, and in a way, many of these ideas are kind of being tested in the current video game Commonhood, which is yet to be released in a way. So many of them are certainly kind of theories, and we'll see how that kind of plays out when it's in the open.
Could you expand a bit more on the Uncommonhodaza project, and specifically on this aspiration maybe to have this form a new mode of architectural authorship, in relation to open source knowledge production, etc.
Right. So like my first video game, Blockwood, was in a way was the first attempt to do a publicly available piece of software for architectural thinking, right? One in which you would be able to, like a large audience. I mean, everything that I've done before had been like little softwares for myself, right? Like a little kind of sketch. And I think most architects, we learn how to program or how to engage with technology in these little softwares that we, know how to use, and they serve ourselves, but it's very different to kind of take it to something that might interface a public, right? And I think that there's a series of kind of different challenges in doing so. And that first project gravitated to kind of talk about ecology and interdependence, as you mentioned previously. Some of the mechanics were central in regards to ecology, and that has been carried on to my next project, Commonhood. But there's been a second layer, one that is slightly more narrative, perhaps, and trying to kind of make a lot more explicit kind of a social condition. I felt like in many ways, some of the shortcomings of my first game, Blockwood, was trying to treat the city or a kind of an architectural model as kind of devoid of history or devoid from a social narrative in a way. So in a way, I think games do this very well when they're very charged, and they're kind of what I would call a game. It's a game. It's a software with an explicit bias, right? So it presents to you a narrative world, a world that is charged with a series of constraints. And I think that in Commonhood, using real world conditions, those of inequality, dispossession, evictions, homelessness, right? Those conditions are kind of the foundation by which the player needs to operate within this world. These are not conditions that you could just avoid or consider not affecting you, right? So you become part of a community in a way, and you have to kind of produce architecture and shelter and different forms of self-provision from within a scope of scarcity, right? So in a way, it's a software that is kind of mediated by scarcity in many ways. The scarcity to material resources, the scarcity to technology, capital, labor, and all of these different elements are simulated in a way in which it would affect the kinds of architecture we might consider, right? So it's certainly very explicit in the game layer. The narrative layer of the game makes everything quite explicit, and the dialogues on the game really kind of present this condition, but it's one that I think softwares have avoided in the past. We've kind of been used to engaging with softwares as a very generic, very kind of abstract piece of technology, one that doesn't, in a way, helps us to look the other way on regards to some of the social challenges that we face in the discipline, right? So I think that doing this move with a game that makes very explicit some of these kind of social contexts, I think it's kind of part of a bet on trying to engage some of these issues and not and work within those issues as a designer, and as a software developer as well.
Yeah, I recently read a text by this philosopher C-Tai Nguyen, who he was writing about kind of philosophy of gaming and video games, and in that he mentioned games being sort of communication vessels for different modes of agency. And I think I find this to be a quite interesting concept and an interesting development that's moving from this sort of systemic thinking that you see in Blockhood into this more kind of introducing other narratives or sort of sensibilities into design. And for me, this is also one thing that's quite interesting for me to think of the video game as a platform for architectural production, is the ability to sort of imbue different sorts of sensibilities or agency that's maybe taking into account it's sort of a variety of different metrics there. In a few years ago, I worked on a plugin for Revit, which was attempting to basically, it was a plugin to do real-time lifecycle analysis calculations at basically the speed of design was the idea. And the general thinking was that if life cycle assessments are normally conducted after a design is complete, somehow this sensibility or consciousness in the process of design is lacking. So I think this was definitely not a game, but this did really get me thinking about how the design of the platforms for architectural production can be sort of authored in a way that maybe produces inherently a more ethical or sustainable or resource efficient architecture or socially just architecture or something like this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that in a similar way, I think that some of those same motivations appear with the production of initially blockhood, which reduces some of these calculations to a very simple diagrammatic form, but certainly several layers of them, right? So when you're thinking about interdependence of resources or like some structural stability or kind of access and synergy between blocks and so on, there's a stacking of some of these conditions, trying to not just look at one channel and say, well, we want to optimize for this condition, but rather kind of create a design that is kind of balancing many of these criteria. And in commonhood, I think that the layer that has been most central has been that of labor, right? And I think that there's a large tradition of video games, which I find in many ways problematic because they're called in board game form, they're called like basically worker placement games, and in video game form, some of them they kind of gravitate to be called tycoon games, where the player is able to kind of organize a sort of startup, right? A form of kind of allocating human resources for, and labor is kind of, you know, used to kind of extract minerals or resources of different forms and then construction, but never kind of seen in some of these simulations a kind of a human dimension beyond that kind of human resource as something that could be deployed by a designer, right? And I think that someone like Jenny Odell with her book, How to Do Nothing, I think that considering the condition that is outside labor, I think a simulation, what we're doing in commonhood is trying to kind of represent or portray people that do participate and collaborate in a labor practice. So they simulate and you can work with them in the production of architecture, but there's also kind of an outside work simulation, right? And one that you might argue, hey, well, this doesn't really serve for optimizing for profit or for kind of how do we make the architectural enterprise more efficient, but it certainly kind of starts to talk about the kind of empathy or the kind of position that different members of a community might have to take as roles as working together towards an objective that kind of does not only consider economic output as a success condition, right, or as a kind of a form of production, but rather one that kind of considers other areas. And I would like to continue expanding that research of how do you create small kind of simulated agents that have more and more, they're not just workers, right? They have a kind of a simulated, expanded capacity and one that kind of creates a push and pull with the player. So the player is not kind of hierarchical king, if you want, or how games sometimes call them, the God game, right? Like where there's kind of full agency on the player, but rather the player feels more entangled and kind of there's a push and pull, and potentially there could be, you know, different like a voting or kind of a democratic process within the game where different agents might vote, you know, differently than what you might want to do. So what is the kind of conversation? And obviously this becomes a lot more interesting when there's multiple players. So therefore we're actually currently working on multiplayer kind of conditions in which would allow multiple players to create communities within the game and really kind of create certain kind of consensus, right, of how do we move forward, what do we do with the production we have, who is the owner or the author of the production that really comes from a collaborative effort, right?
Yeah, I myself was addicted to a roller coaster tycoon as a kid, so I very much understand this kind of what you're speaking about.
Right.
Would you say it seems like moving from blockhood into commonhood, there's kind of a progression from a sort of simulation game into maybe reaching towards using the game as a platform to actually produce real world content. Would that be a fair categorization? And could you speak a bit about like what that transfer, even if it's not in commonhood, like what that transfer from the game space into physical space, real world might look like?
Yeah, so in full disclosure, this is where I'm heading, I would say. As research, I would like to have, develop a software that enables any production by a player to be something that they could actually use for designing something in their backyard or an expansion to their house, or I don't know, a tiny home, or or larger forms of architecture by all means, right? But I think that I'm kind of, slowly, gradually getting there. From Blockhood, there was initially an attempt to kind of have a much stronger correlation with the real world, and I've obviously seen some of the challenges of doing so. With Commonhood, there's been, obviously, it's working at a real scale. There's materials that we're trying to kind of keep as close as possible to materials that you might find available as standard materials. And really, architectural production comes from something that could have a strong correlation with the real world. I think that there's still additional layers and efforts that need to happen in a way to actually take that production outside the simulation space. And I'm definitely kind of thinking of how to kind of participate in those as well. But it's quite interesting that architectural production within a platform such as Commonhood might or might not produce a real world compatible content, right? So I'm sure that a certain portion of the players might be interested in that challenge, while others will not, right? And ultimately, it shouldn't be my agenda to dictate what kind of value should be produced within the platform. So I think that enabling, we're much more thinking about tools that would enable communities to define their own local form of value, as opposed to imposing, hey, this is kind of what we want to happen, right? So there's no current kind of imposition of this kind of idea within the games, but we're definitely trying to allow for tools that would maybe suggest someone could say, hey, this is an assembly that is kind of trying to be a real world assembly, and maybe you could have versions of that, or communities gravitating to that kind of content, while others might be motivated by a different form of, I don't know, interior design, or a different form of architecture that might have purely entertainment means. And I think that understanding the diversity within kind of a player base is certainly important and central to allowing for a kind of a pluralistic and kind of not really trying to centralize an effort, centrally not making it my effort, and use players for it. I think that there's always been an interest of offering kind of tools that players would kind of appropriate and make their own, right? So we're constantly like listening to what are the things that they need, and expand on those areas, as opposed to only on the areas that we might consider important.
Yeah, I see there this idea of, or this tension. I think you speak about this in the book, but about oftentimes when things are described as open worlds or open systems within games, they actually are really not. They're at the same time a frame that's been designed by a designer or with particular limitations. And I think it's an interesting question that emerges of how you can design a platform or a game in a way that also the players are able to kind of change the rules of the game themselves, or sort of adapt this, or have the game be truly an open, evolving system. Great.
I think that could be, I think within the gaming world, that could be achieved with things like modding. I think that there's a strong culture for the modification of games by players, but in a way, those have been also fundamentally at a different hierarchical level than the game production itself. I think that there could be a model in which there would be much less distinction between the core game and a mod, meaning like a kind of expansion of the game, so that slowly the some of the initial ideas of the game could really start kind of being appropriated by the players that really, again, going back to kind of the notion of the commons, but in this sense of a digital community, there is a sense of stewardship or the kind of appropriation and ownership for a particular resource, and if that resource is useful and if one has a life of its own, I think that you know, there should be the opportunity to do that, right? I think that that's I mean, I would love to kind of, you know, work with players to kind of make something like that happen, to gradually kind of open the different aspects of the game, or expanding the game for it to really kind of have a life from the community that is actually using it, right?
One of the other questions that came to mind concerning this like leakage or this passover from the game world into the physical world was had to do with the use of material resources. One of the, I mean, this research about the non-extractive architecture is quite expensive, but generally, I think we're trying to also imagine an architecture that relies on kind of far less use of material resources. I'm wondering, do you see a tension that exists between the sort of like infinite combinatorial possibilities that exist within game space and sort of the ambition to use like a small amount of actual physical materials in the real world?
Right. So I think that this is an interesting point. I have my own personal view on this, but I you know, there might be obviously different attitudes. The way in which I've been seeing, and I talk about this in the book, the notion of, let's call it ephemeralization, which is what Bucky Fuller describes as, you know, like, let's do more with less. It's certainly happening, but it's, as I argue in the book, it's not happening with the impact that Bucky at least intended originally, in the sense that he was expecting that because we're able to do more with less, there would be more for everyone. There would be a kind of a prosperity emerging out of this kind of optimization. In a way, what we're seeing is actually that because we're doing more with less, some, especially those that own such an enterprise, or the copyrights, or, you know, the patents, are able to kind of harvest kind of a larger portion of the profits, right? And so, you know, we've seen beautiful research work by different research groups throughout the world that maybe can reduce the amount of concrete necessary for creating a slab, or we're using carbon fiber materials to create incredibly thin and very strong structures, right? But then the question for me comes, well, are we doing this because we're all gonna be able to do more with less for a larger portion of the population, or because it's going to increase the profit margins of someone using this technology? So in many ways, the proposition, which could be one of many, right? The proposition of a discrete form of architecture, which is, you know, I make a kind of an argument for a defense for parts. It really comes from the notion of reversibility and repurposing of parts that could be designed to have a multiplicity of encounters, right? One in which architecture could take one form, but could also be adapted into others, right? So the resources that we're using are precious in a way, and we ought not to be thinking of buildings that we are completely destroying, but perhaps we can repurpose or design into their tectonics opportunities to recombine them, or kind of, you know, use them as raw resources for other alternative projects, right? So I think that the proposition of the discrete comes from trying to combine two things. One is the kind of obviously the recombination of resources, but also a practice of architecture, you know, architectural production that might remain social and might remain multi-actor, right? That might not require us to have a kind of a centralized large factory where, you know, we are kind of optimizing maybe to thin layers of concrete slab to achieve kind of a great performance, but those are kind of owned by a very kind of centralized or hierarchical structure that might alienate the production of architecture by communities or the idea of self-production, right? So I think that the discrete approach might have certain shortcomings in its kind of performance, but I think that it certainly excels at offering a social framework and one of reusability, I think, as well, and reversibility of building tectonics as a strategy for not having to, you know, think of a building anew every time.
Mm-hmm. And as far as I understand, would you say that the discrete protocol or paradigm it's not just about this sort of kit of parts building blocks, but as I understand, it's also about this sort of digital layer or intelligence behind that? Or is that a view that maybe, yeah?
I think that there's a lot of people right now. I think I was part of a group of people that study together, you know, and have some connection. People like Jill Retzin or Daniel Kohler, and people that have been talking and working on the discrete. And I think that many of us have different approaches to what we are calling discrete. In my view, like I started working on discrete architecture with the project Bloom, which was a collaboration with Elisa Androshek for the 2012 Olympics. And really thinking, I remember writing back then, how do we reconsider serial repetition, right? Like if we are focusing 100% on at the time, the kind of computational paradigm was of non-standard architecture, right? We would actually differentiate parts. Therefore, we could actually have architecture was highly bespoke architecture. But what if we would serialize parts as we had done prior, but really transfer the role of you know, form articulation to the combination of parts that could have been serialized. So Bloom was an attempt to add a game layer to that paradigm where parts are all the same, but they could be combined in many different forms. So for me, that was a kind of also the beginning of not only games as a kind of a combinatorial framework, but also discrete as a way of reusing parts in different contexts, right? And creating families of parts that, you know, work together in different ways. I think that the notion of the discrete is fundamentally to do with the kit of parts, and for me has to do with the social affordances of that, so how social systems would kind of relate to that tectonic proposition. It doesn't necessarily it's linked to a digital layer, right? In my particular case, I think that the layer of games and platforms, it's an opportunity to allow for a place where these combinatorics could happen beyond what we could actually practice as a physical resource. So as much as the Bloom project was done physically in the London 2012 Olympics, I want to take that kind of gameplay or that kind of combinatorial production into a digital space. So I think that a game really, a video game offered the opportunity to do so. So it does couple, I think, the proposition of a discrete architecture, one that could be recombined in a multiplicity of forms, right? But I don't see, I think that that's a kind of a coupling that I'm putting forward in a way, but it doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, working together.
Yeah, I think what's exciting about this project is like this kind of large set of combinatorial possibilities doesn't necessarily come from the design system itself, but comes from when the design system encounters a social system. And that I find super compelling about this project and more broadly your work. So maybe kind of as a last question, I'd like to ask, in your view, based on kind of whatever personal definition you might hold towards extraction or non-extractive architecture, do you think that this is even possible? And if so, what do you think this might look like to achieve more like non-extractive practices of architecture?
I think so. I definitely think so. I think that in my book, I finish with an example that is very dear to my heart, which is the Amareda cooperative in Chile, which is the open city of Ritoque. where I see in many ways that the role of the architect within kind of has a very different, it's very different. It's kind of much more connected to community, and especially in the production of value systems that are not imposed by any external factor, but rather kind of emerge locally, right? In that particular case, have to do with the territory, with poetry, and those are not to be. I think I'm a big fan of when I see projects that kind of create their own kind of value systems and kind of really are not fundamentally operating and following certain trends globally, right? Here in the city of Detroit, I've encountered such initiatives as well. I think that there is a lot of, in my view, a lot of hope for these practices to continue flourishing. And in many ways, I don't think that these practices might completely override the practice of architecture as we have it. And the idea of having it, your question talks about, is it even possible, right? I think that it's certainly possible as we have it. It might not become the overarching paradigm of architecture, or it might not do it very soon. But I think that we ought to be looking and kind of celebrating those practices. And I think that, for instance, Stefan Graber did a beautiful book called The Atlas of Commoning, which I think it's kind of rescuing and kind of documenting practices of architecture that throughout the world have been really gravitating to find this form of operation. I think that, you know, this is the work that I kind of doing with my students as well, like really kind of studying them and understanding what is the role that architects could have, and define and design a discipline, not kind of define as a kind of a fixed boundary, as a disciplinary boundary, but rather kind of poke into that boundary and change the protocols by which architects operate in the world. Looking at some examples like the ones that Stefan has done so well documented. So I think that that's an ongoing work that you know, I hope to contribute something to as well.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this, and also for the work that you do in kind of bringing these ideas a bit closer to reality. So it's been really great to be able to speak with you.
Likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.